We wish you were never born. The restaurant glowed with warm amber light, the kind of light that makes every plate of food look like a painting and every smile look sincere. 24-year-old Maren Ellis sat at the head of a long table dressed in white linen, her graduation cap resting beside her water glass like a trophy she still couldn't quite believe she'd earned. She was the first person in her family to graduate from college. Not just graduate. She'd finished with honors, a degree in mechanical engineering, 3 years of scholarships stacked on top of 2 part-time jobs she'd worked since she was 19. Tonight, her aunts and uncles had flown in. Her grandmother sat to her right, her hand resting on Maren's arm the entire evening like she was afraid to let go. Old friends from high school squeezed into the far end of the table, laughing too loud, the way people do when they're genuinely happy for someone. Maren kept glancing at her parents. Her mother, Diane, sat stiffly at the other end, sipping wine and saying little. Her father, Russell, scrolled his phone between courses. Maren told herself it didn't matter. Tonight was different. Tonight surely would be the night her parents finally looked at her the way they looked at her younger brother, Colton, who hadn't finished a single semester of community college but had never once been told he wasn't good enough. When the waiter cleared the plates and someone tapped a fork against a wine glass, the table quieted. Diane stood. Maren's heart lifted. Her mother was going to give a toast. Maybe, finally, the words she'd waited her whole life to hear. Diane raised her glass, looked directly at her daughter, and said it plainly, without a tremor in her voice, as though she were commenting on the weather. "We wish you were never born." The words landed like a dropped glass, shattering across the table. Silverware stopped clinking. A waiter froze mid-step. Maren's grandmother's hand tightened on her arm. Somewhere near the back, a stranger at another table turned to look. Maren waited for her father to say something. Anything. A correction. A joke to diffuse it. An apology. Instead, Russell nodded slowly, eyes still on his phone, as if his wife had simply confirmed something they'd discussed privately many times before. The guests didn't know where to look. Maren's cousins stared at their napkins. Colton examined the tablecloth like it held the answers to a test he hadn't studied for. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended her. Maren didn't cry. She didn't yell. She reached over, picked up her graduation cap from beside her water glass, set it gently in the center of the table, right beside the untouched cake with her name written in blue icing, and stood up. She walked out of the restaurant without looking back, the cold night air hitting her face like the first honest thing she'd felt all evening. The car ride home that night was quiet, but Maren's mind was loud, dragging her backward through 24 years of small cruelties she had spent her whole life trying to explain away. She remembered being 8 years old, bringing home a report card covered in A's, watching her mother glance at it for half a second before saying, "Colton needs help with his reading. Go check on him." She remembered being 12, making the honor roll 3 years running, and never once seeing the certificate make it onto the refrigerator, while Colton's participation trophy sat on the mantel for a decade. She remembered the scholarship letter at 16, the one that would eventually pay for most of her tuition. She'd run into the kitchen, breathless, waving the letter. Her father had looked up from the newspaper just long enough to say, "Don't let it go to your head." She remembered soccer games her parents never attended, award ceremonies where the seat beside her grandmother stayed the only occupied one in her section, and the 2 jobs she juggled through college, the diner shifts before 7 a.m. classes, the weekend retail shifts that ate her Saturdays, because when she'd asked her parents for help with tuition, her mother had said, "We didn't ask you to be born. We're not obligated to pay for your choices." Most of all, she remembered the phrase that had followed her since childhood, muttered during arguments, tossed out during Christmas dinners like it was nothing. "You were an accident. You weren't supposed to happen." The only steady warmth in Maren's life had been her grandmother, Eleanor. It was Eleanor who'd shown up to every choir concert, every award ceremony, every late-night phone call when Maren doubted herself. It was Eleanor who'd once quietly slipped her $300 in an envelope during her hardest semester, whispering, "Don't tell your mother." Even after all of it, the dismissals, the comparisons, the cruelty disguised as honesty, Maren had still hoped. She'd told herself that walking across that graduation stage, tassel swinging, diploma in hand, would finally be enough. That maybe achievement was the language her parents understood, even if love wasn't. She was wrong, and now she knew it. 3 days after the dinner, Eleanor showed up at Maren's apartment, holding a worn leather folder and a look on her face that Maren had never seen before. Guilt, heavy and long carried. "I should have told you this years ago," Eleanor said, sitting at the small kitchen table. "I let my silence protect people who never deserved it." She explained that Maren had never been unwanted. Not truly. The truth was harder and sadder. Diane had been on the edge of a promising career in architecture when she became pregnant with Marin unexpectedly before she and Russell were ready. The promotion she'd been chasing went to someone else. In the years that followed, Diane never separated the disappointment of that lost opportunity from the daughter who arrived alongside it. Russell, unwilling to challenge his wife's version of events, simply agreed with her. Every time for over 2 decades. "It was never about you not being good enough," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "It was about her blaming you for a choice that was never yours to make." Then Eleanor opened the folder. Inside were documents Marin had never seen. A trust fund Eleanor had quietly established when Marin was only 7 years old, meant to cover her education. Diane and Russell had discovered its existence years later and tried twice to access the funds for their own use. Both attempts had failed. Eleanor had structured the trust so tightly that only Marin, upon proof of enrollment, could ever touch it. "That's part of why they resented you working so hard for tuition," Eleanor admitted. "They knew the money existed. They just couldn't get to it." She placed the folder in Marin's hands along with a stack of old letters. Proof, explanation, and an apology that had waited far too long to be spoken. Marin didn't cry at the news. She'd used up her tears long before the folder ever opened. Within 2 weeks, she'd signed a lease on a small apartment 2 states away in a city where nobody knew her last name or her family's history. She packed her car with what mattered, left the rest behind, and blocked every family member except her grandmother from every phone, every platform, every possible point of contact. She started therapy her first month in the new city, unpacking 2 decades of conditioning with a counselor who gently, patiently helped her understand that she had never been the problem. Some sessions left her exhausted. Others left her lighter than she'd felt in years. Slowly, she built a life that belonged only to her. She found a job as a junior engineer at a firm that actually noticed her work. Coworkers became friends, and friends became something closer to family. People who showed up for her birthday, who checked in without being asked, who celebrated her wins instead of dismissing them. 18 months in, she earned her first promotion. Then, a year later, a second. She started sleeping through the night. She started laughing without catching herself. For the first time in her adult life, Marin wasn't performing worthiness for anyone. She was simply living. Word travels, even across state lines, even through people who swore they wouldn't say anything. Back home, cracks began forming. Russell's small business hit a rough patch, and without Marin's quiet, unacknowledged financial contributions of years past, the birthday money she'd always handed over, the emergency loans she'd never gotten back, the family's finances grew tighter. Colton, the favored son, offered nothing. He'd grown used to being given to, not asked from, and had no intention of reversing the pattern now. Relatives who'd sat frozen at that restaurant table finally started talking. The story of the toast spread through the extended family like a slow-burning fire. Aunts who stopped calling, cousins who quietly unfollowed, a family reputation that had once rested on appearances now cracking under the weight of what everyone had witnessed and said nothing about. Diane and Russell tried reaching out. Texts arrived every few months, each one softer than the last. "We miss you. Can we just forget the past? Family is family." Marin read every message and answered none of them. She wasn't punishing them. She simply understood. Finally, that forgetting wasn't healing. It was just another way of erasing herself to keep the peace. 4 years passed. Marin built a life so full it barely resembled the one she'd left. Then, on a quiet Tuesday, she got the call she'd been dreading. Eleanor had passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the dignity she'd always carried. Marin flew home for the funeral. She stood at the gravesite in a black coat, composed, present, mourning the one person who had never made her feel like an accident. Afterward, at the small gathering, Diane approached her, eyes swollen, hands trembling. Russell trailed behind, quieter than Marin had ever seen him. Diane cried in a way Marin had never witnessed, not performative, not strategic, just raw. Russell finally spoke the words that had been owed for over 2 decades. "We were wrong. We're sorry. Please, we need your help." Marin listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. She simply let them speak until there was nothing left to say. When they finished, Marin reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph. Herself at 22, cap and gown, a smile that hadn't yet learned what was coming. She turned it over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting from years earlier, were 7 words neither of them had ever expected to see again. "We wish you were never born." "That was the last gift you ever gave me," Marin said quietly, her voice steady. "It taught me to stop begging for love that never existed." She handed them a sealed envelope. She watched Diane's hands shake as she opened it, clearly expecting a check, a lifeline, some kind of financial rescue. Instead, inside were 3 things: A copy of the restaurant receipt from that graduation dinner, a printed copy of the valedictorian speech Marin had once dreamed of giving to make them proud, and a short, handwritten note. I finally believe you, so I built a life without you. Marin didn't wait for a reaction. She turned, walked back to her car, and drove away from the cemetery without looking in the rearview mirror. Years later, Marin's life looked nothing like the one she'd once begged her parents to be proud of, and everything like the one she'd chosen for herself. She led a full engineering team at a company she loved. She'd married a partner who never once made her doubt her worth, who celebrated her the way she'd waited a lifetime to be celebrated. On weekends, she volunteered with a mentorship program for first-generation college students from difficult homes, sitting across from teenagers who reminded her so much of who she used to be. Kids terrified that no achievement would ever be enough. She kept the graduation cap, not as a reminder of the night it happened, but as proof of what came after. Freedom, chosen family, a life built entirely on her own terms. The family you're born into shapes your beginning, she'd tell the students, setting the old cap on the table beside her. But the family you choose shapes your future.